The warm September evening wrapped around Flatwoods, West Virginia, like a comfortable blanket. The year was 1952, and the small town was just settling into its usual quiet routine as the sun began to set. Tawny Bennett and Mike Fisher walked along the dirt road that led from the town's only baseball field, their worn gloves tucked under their arms and dust coating their sneakers. "Think your brother James will be home tonight?" Mike asked, kicking the small stone along the path. He looked up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to peek through. Tommy shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe. He's been spending a lot of time fixing up old Mr. Wilson's tractor. Says it helps him not think about Korea so much." At 13, Tommy didn't fully understand what his older brother had been through in the war, but he knew James had come back different. The boys continued their walk home, talking about their baseball practice and wondering if they'd make the school team next spring. The evening air was growing cooler, and crickets had started their nightly chorus from the surrounding fields. It was just like any other night in Flatwoods. Until it wasn't. The change came suddenly. First, the crickets went silent, as if someone had flipped a switch. Then came the light, not from above like a normal shooting star, but moving across the sky like a car on an invisible road. It glowed an eerie green color that reminded Tommy of the glow-in-the-dark watch his uncle had brought him from Pittsburgh. "Mike, look." Tommy pointed at the strange light. His friend's mouth fell open as they both watched it move across the darkening sky. The light pulsed rhythmically, leaving behind a trail that seemed to hang in the air for several seconds before fading away. It was nothing like the airplanes they sometimes saw flying overhead, and it moved too slowly and deliberately to be a falling star. "What do you think it is?" Mike whispered, though there was no one else around to hear them. Tommy shook his head, his eyes never leaving the mysterious object. "I don't know, but it's heading toward Fisher's farm." He grabbed Mike's arm. "Come on." The boys broke into a run, following the dirt road as it curved around the base of the hill. The strange light continued its descent, now moving lower and lower until it disappeared behind the tree line with a flash that lit up the evening sky like silent lightning. A deep boom followed several seconds later, making the ground tremble beneath their feet. Birds erupted from the trees in the distance, their dark shapes visible against the purple-orange sky, as they fled whatever had disturbed their rest. Tommy and Mike stood frozen, their hearts pounding. The woods ahead of them, usually so familiar and unthreatening, now seemed dark and full of mystery. A faint green glow pulsed from somewhere behind the trees, like a beacon calling them forward. "We should tell someone," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "My dad says there have been other strange lights reported up and down the East Coast." Tommy nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. James will know what to do. He's seen all sorts of strange things in the war. He turned to his friend, his eyes bright with excitement and fear. "Race you to my house." Mike hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the woods where the green glow continued to pulse. "Okay, but we're getting adults before we do anything else." "Promise." "Promise," Tommy agreed, though in his mind, he was already imagining himself as the hero who discovered whatever lay waiting in those woods. The boys ran toward town, their footsteps kicking up dust in the growing darkness. Behind them, the strange glow in the woods seemed to pulse stronger, as if responding to their departure. Something had arrived in Flatwoods that evening, something that would change their small town forever. And Tommy Bennett knew, with the certainty that only a 13-year-old could possess, that he was going to be part of whatever happened next. Tommy and Mike burst through the screen door of the Bennett house, letting it slam behind them with a loud bang. The noise brought James Bennett running from the kitchen, still holding the sandwich he'd been making. At 25, James looked older than his years, his face carrying the serious expression he'd brought back from Korea. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately alert. The war had taught him to react quickly to sudden situations. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost." "We saw something in the sky." Tommy spoke between heavy breaths. "It wasn't a plane or a shooting star." It went down in the woods near Fisher's farm. His words tumbled out fast and excited. James set his sandwich down on the nearby table, his expression turning serious. "Slow down, Tommy. Tell me exactly what you saw." As Tommy described the strange green light and its controlled descent, a new voice joined the conversation. "Did you say a green light?" Eleanor Davis stood in the open doorway, her arms full of science textbooks. The boy's noise had caught her attention as she walked past the house on her way home from the school. Eleanor taught science at the local high school, and everyone in town knew she had a special interest in astronomy. She'd even built a small observatory in her backyard, complete with a telescope her late husband had given her before the war. "Yes, ma'am," Mike answered politely. "It moved like nothing I've ever seen before, not like a plane at all." Eleanor set her books down and pulled out a small notebook from her pocket. "Tell me more about its movement. Did it change direction? Was the light steady or pulsing?" James watched the boys answer Eleanor's questions, his hand unconsciously touching the rifle that hung over the fireplace. The war had taught him that unusual things often meant danger, but Eleanor's scientific curiosity was making him reconsider his initial worry. "We should check it out," Eleanor finally said, closing her notebook. "There have been similar sightings reported in the newspapers, but no one's gotten close enough to properly document anything." "It could be dangerous," James warned, thinking of his time in Korea. "If something did crash out there." "That's why we need you with us," Eleanor replied firmly. "You have military experience. The boys can show us where they saw it go down, and I can document everything properly. We should also bring some equipment." Tommy ran to the kitchen and came back with flashlights. "Dad always keeps these ready for power outages." James hesitated, looking at the growing darkness outside. Then he walked to the fireplace and took down his hunting rifle. "Better to have it and not need it," he muttered, checking that it was unloaded before adding ammunition to his pocket. Just then, they heard the sound of tires on gravel. Through the window, they saw Sheriff Robert Miller's patrol car pulling up to the house. The sheriff stepped out, his face visible in the porch light. "Evening, folks," he said as he approached the door. "Got 3 calls about strange lights in the sky. Thought I'd check around town before heading out to investigate." Eleanor quickly filled him in on what the boys had seen. Sheriff Miller listened carefully, his hand resting on his service pistol. Like James, he'd served in the war, and unusual situations made him cautious. "Well," he said finally, "seems like we got ourselves a proper search party, but we do this by the book. No one goes running off alone, and everyone stays together." James nodded in agreement. "We should bring water and some basic first aid supplies too, just in case." As the adults discussed their plans, Tommy and Mike exchanged excited glances. This was turning into the biggest adventure of their lives. Tommy noticed that the strange metallic smell from earlier had grown stronger, and when he looked out the window toward Fisher's farm, he could still see a faint green glow pulsing in the distance. "5 minutes to gather what we need," Sheriff Miller announced. "Then we head out together. Whatever's out there, we're going to find it." Eleanor smiled at the boys. "Looks like you two might have stumbled onto something important. Just remember to stay close to us, okay?" Tommy and Mike nodded eagerly, but Tommy's mind was already racing ahead to what they might find in the woods. The smell in the air, the mysterious light, the strange silence. It all pointed to something beyond his wildest imagination. The small group made their way along the darkened path toward Fisher's farm, their flashlight beams cutting through the evening shadows. Sheriff Miller took the lead, with James bringing up the rear. Eleanor walked between them, her notebook ready in her hand, while Tommy and Mike stayed close to the adults as promised. The night had grown unusually quiet. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, and even the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was missing. The only sound was the crunch of their shoes on the dirt path and their own careful breathing. "The air smells different," Eleanor said, stopping to write something in her notebook, "like copper pennies and ozone." The way it smells just before a lightning storm. James nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. Reminds me of hot metal, like a tank that's been running too long. His war memories flickered at the edges of his mind, but he pushed them away. This was different. As they walked deeper into the woods, Tommy noticed strange marks on the trees. His flashlight beam revealed that the bark looked scorched in places, forming odd patterns that seemed to point in the direction they were heading. "Look at these markings," Eleanor said, running her hand over one of the burned patches. "They're warm to the touch. And notice how they're all on the same side of the trees." Sheriff Miller examined the marks closely. "Never seen anything like this in all my years of service. Not even brush fires leave marks like these." The green glow they'd been following grew stronger as they moved forward. It pulsed with a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. The metallic smell grew stronger too, making their eyes water slightly. Mike grabbed Tommy's arm suddenly. "Did you hear that?" Everyone stopped moving, straining to listen. At first, there was only silence, but then they heard it. A low humming sound, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant electric generator. "It's coming from up ahead," James whispered, moving his rifle to a ready position. "Through those trees." The group approached more carefully now, their movements slow and deliberate. The humming grew louder, and the air began to feel heavy and thick, like walking through invisible syrup. Eleanor's scientific instruments, which she'd brought in her bag, started behaving strangely. Her compass spun in circles, and her small radiation detector clicked faster than normal. "The magnetic field in this area is completely disrupted," she muttered, making quick notes. "And there's some kind of radiation present. Not dangerous levels, but definitely abnormal." They came to a small ridge overlooking a clearing. Sheriff Miller signaled them to stop and get low. From their position, they could see that the trees around the clearing had been pushed outward, as if something had landed with great force and swept them aside like matchsticks. "That's where we saw it come down," Tommy whispered, pointing toward the center of the clearing. The green glow was brightest there, pulsing from something they couldn't quite see through the thick undergrowth. As they watched, a mist began to form in the clearing, glowing faintly with the same greenish tint. It moved against the wind, swirling in unnatural patterns. The humming sound grew stronger, making their teeth vibrate slightly. "We should spread out a bit," Sheriff Miller suggested quietly. "Get a better view from different angles, but stay within sight of each other." James positioned himself behind a large oak tree, his rifle ready but pointed safely downward. Eleanor moved to a spot where she could better observe and document whatever they might find. The boys stayed close to Sheriff Miller, their earlier excitement now mixed with growing nervousness. The mist continued to swirl and thicken, and through it, they began to see something take shape. Something tall and unlike anything they'd ever seen before. The humming changed pitch, becoming higher and more intense. Tommy's flashlight beam caught something reflective in the mist, something that looked like metal, but moved like it was alive. And then, through the swirling green fog, they saw the eyes. Red, glowing eyes that seemed to stare directly into their souls. The creature in the clearing stood over 10 feet tall. Its body seemed to be covered in a dark metallic material that reflected their flashlight beams in strange ways. But it was the head that made everyone freeze in place. A large, hood-like shape with those terrible glowing red eyes. Sheriff Miller raised his pistol slowly, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "We don't know its intentions. It hasn't made any aggressive moves." The being turned toward them, its movement smooth and unnatural. The hood-like head tilted to one side, studying them with those piercing red eyes. The green mist swirled around its feet, and the humming sound changed pitch again, becoming almost musical. "It's some kind of suit," James said quietly, his military training helping him stay calm. "Look at the joints and seams. Whatever's inside needs protection to be here." Tommy and Mike huddled behind a fallen log, unable to look away. The creature was both terrifying and fascinating. Its suit seemed to shift colors slightly as it moved, like oil on water in the sunlight. Suddenly, the being took a step forward. The ground trembled slightly under its weight. Sheriff Miller tensed, his hand still on his pistol, but Eleanor moved forward instead, her scientific curiosity overtaking her fear. "Eleanor, get back," James hissed, raising his rifle slightly. But Eleanor held up her hand for silence. She had noticed something about the creature's movements. "It's injured," she said softly. "Look at how it's favoring its right side. And that green mist. I think it's leaking from the suit." As if confirming her words, the being stumbled slightly. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out to steady itself against a tree. Where it touched the bark, frost immediately formed, spreading in crystal patterns. "The cold," Eleanor said, making quick notes in her book. "Its natural environment must be much colder than ours. The suit probably helps it survive here." The creature made a sound then, a series of clicking noises followed by a high-pitched tone that made everyone's heads hurt. Tommy covered his ears, but he noticed that the sound had a pattern to it, like someone trying to speak in a different language. Eleanor took another careful step forward. She raised her flashlight and moved it in a deliberate pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long ones, 3 short ones again. Everyone held their breath, waiting. The being stood perfectly still for a moment. Then, to everyone's amazement, it raised its own hand. A soft light emerged from what looked like a device attached to its suit, copying Eleanor's pattern exactly. "It's trying to communicate," Eleanor whispered excitedly. "It understands pattern recognition." But before she could try another sequence, the creature's suit made a harsh grinding noise. A new cloud of green mist burst from its side, larger than before. The being staggered, its movements becoming less smooth, more desperate. "Everyone back," James shouted, moving forward to pull Eleanor away. The mist was spreading rapidly, and wherever it touched, the grass and leaves began to frost over. Sheriff Miller finally drew his pistol fully. "We need to leave. Now." But Tommy saw something in the creature's movements that the adults didn't notice. It wasn't attacking. It was asking for help. The way it held out its hand, the way it tried to move toward them despite its obvious difficulty, reminded him of when James had come home from the war, hurt and needing his family's help. "Wait," Tommy called out, surprising himself with his own courage. "Ms. Davis is right. It's hurt. Look at how it's reaching out. It needs help." The creature turned its hooded head toward Tommy's voice. The red eyes flickered, and for a moment they seemed less threatening, more desperate. The being made the clicking sound again, softer this time, almost like a plea. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Tommy's right. Whatever this is, wherever it came from, right now it needs our help. And this might be humanity's first chance to make peaceful contact with something from beyond our world." The green mist continued to leak from the creature's suit, making the air thick and hard to breathe. James remembered his gas mask training from Korea and quickly pulled his shirt over his nose. "Everyone, cover your faces," he ordered, helping Tommy and Mike with their shirts. Eleanor's eyes were watering, but she kept watching the being carefully. She noticed how it moved away from its own mist, as if trying to protect them. "It's not attacking," she said through her covered mouth. "The gas release is accidental, like a car leaking oil." The creature made more clicking sounds, different from before. Its red eyes flickered rapidly, and it pressed what looked like buttons on its suit with its strange, 3-fingered hands. The grinding noise got louder. "Back up, but don't run," James advised, his military experience helping him stay focused. Sudden movements might scare it. He kept his rifle pointed down but ready, watching as the being continued to work on its suit. Tommy, fighting against the urge to cough, noticed something interesting. "Look at how it keeps touching that round part on its chest," he said, "like it's trying to fix something." Eleanor nodded excitedly despite the situation. "Good observation, Tommy. That might be the suit's main control panel." She pulled out her flashlight again, and began tapping it against a tree in a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. The creature stopped moving. Its red eyes focused on Eleanor's flashlight. After a moment, it raised its hand and tapped against its suit in the same pattern. "It's working," Eleanor exclaimed. She quickly changed the pattern. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. The being responded perfectly, copying the new pattern. Then it added its own, a complex series of taps that seemed to mean something specific. It pointed to the damaged section of its suit, then up at the sky. "I think," Eleanor paused, considering. "I think it's trying to tell us it's not from Earth, and its life support system is damaged." Sheriff Miller lowered his pistol slightly. "If that's true, it came an awful long way to die in West Virginia." "It's not going to die," Tommy said firmly, surprising the adults with his determination. "We can help fix it. Dad fixes broken machinery all the time. This is just a different kind of machine." The creature seemed to understand something was happening. It moved closer, more carefully this time, trying to minimize the leaking gas. Its movements reminded James of wounded soldiers trying not to scare civilians. Deliberate, non-threatening, but desperate. Eleanor started a new pattern with her flashlight. Simple mathematics this time. 1 flash, pause. 2 flashes, pause. 3 flashes. The being quickly responded with 4 flashes, then 5, understanding the sequence. "It's intelligent," Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder. "Highly intelligent. It understands mathematical progression instantly." Another burst of green mist made everyone step back. The being's movements became more jerky, less controlled. James recognized the signs of growing panic. Even aliens, it seemed, could fear death. "Ms. Davis," Tommy said suddenly, "what if we showed it we know about machines? My dad's welding equipment could fix those cracks in its suit. It's just metal, right?" Eleanor's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant, Tommy. Simple repairs might be enough to stop the leaks." She turned to the creature and began a new series of light patterns, trying to communicate their intention to help. The being watched the lights, its red eyes glowing steadily now. After a moment, it reached down and picked up a small stone. Using movements that seemed carefully controlled, it drew a simple diagram in the dirt, what looked like a rough sketch of its suit, with X marks showing the damaged areas. "It understands," Eleanor breathed. "It's showing us exactly what needs to be fixed." James looked at Sheriff Miller. "Bob, we've got to try. If we don't help, it'll either die here or be forced to hurt someone by accident with that gas. Neither option is good for Flatwoods." Sheriff Miller holstered his pistol with a sigh. "Never thought I'd be helping an alien fix its spacesuit. Tommy, run home and get your father's welding gear. But be quick, and don't tell anyone else yet. The last thing we need is the whole town showing up." While Tommy ran back to get the welding equipment, Eleanor continued her light communication with the creature. She had switched to using mathematical equations, flashing her light in sequences that represented simple formulas. The being responded each time, not just copying her patterns but expanding on them, showing its deep understanding of mathematics. "It's incredible," Eleanor said, scribbling rapidly in her notebook. "It just solved a calculus problem I've been working on with my advanced students. Solved it in seconds." The creature had settled into a more stable position, seemingly trying to conserve energy. It kept one hand pressed against the leaking part of its suit, which had slowed the release of the green gas. The night air had grown very cold around it, with frost covering everything within a 10-foot radius. James watched carefully, his rifle now slung over his shoulder. "The cold seems to help it," he observed. "Notice how it moves better when the temperature drops." Mike, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "But why did it come here? Of all places, why Flatwoods?" The being responded to Mike's voice by turning its hooded head toward him. It raised its free hand and pointed up at the stars, then drew another diagram in the dirt. This time, it showed several circles, planets. Eleanor realized, with lines connecting them. "It's showing us a map," Eleanor explained, studying the drawing. "See this circle with the ring around it? That must be Saturn. And this one here, with the lines pointing to it, that's Earth." The creature added more marks to its drawing, showing what looked like a path between the planets. Then it drew a rough shape that resembled its ship, but with damage marks on one side. "I think I understand," Eleanor said slowly. "It didn't choose Flatwood specifically. It had to land here because its ship was damaged. Maybe it hit something in space, or something went wrong with its equipment." Sheriff Miller squinted at the drawing. "So it's not an invasion, just an accident." The being made its clicking sound again, but softer this time, almost musical. It added more to its drawing, showing what looked like resources being collected from different planets. Eleanor's eyes widened as she understood. "It's an explorer," she said excitedly. "Like our own scientists who travel to remote places to study and gather samples. It's not here to harm us. It's here to learn." Just then, they heard Tommy returning, panting from his run. He carried his father's welding gear in both arms, nearly dropping it in his hurry. "Got it," he called out, keeping his voice low. "Dad was asleep, so I left him a note saying I'd borrowed it for a school project." The creature turned toward the welding equipment with interest. Its red eyes seemed to scan the tools, and it made a series of rapid clicking sounds that somehow sounded approving. Eleanor took charge of the situation. "James, you know how to weld, right? From your time in the motor pool?" James nodded. "Basic repairs, yeah. But this isn't exactly a Jeep we're fixing here." "The principles should be the same," Eleanor said. "Metal is metal, whether it's from Earth or wherever our friend here comes from." The being seemed to understand they were ready to help. It straightened up to its full height, over 10 feet tall, then slowly and deliberately knelt down to make the damaged part of its suit more accessible. The movement was clearly meant to appear non-threatening, despite its massive size. "Well, I'll be," Sheriff Miller muttered. "Never thought I'd see anything like this in my lifetime." Eleanor started setting up the welding equipment with James's help. "We're about to make history here," she said quietly. "The first humans to help repair an alien spacesuit, and no one outside this group will probably ever know about it." The creature watched them work with its glowing red eyes, and for the first time, those eyes didn't seem scary anymore. They looked curious, intelligent, and maybe even a little grateful. Whatever differences existed between their species, in this moment they were just living beings helping each other in a time of need. Sarah walked down the dirt path toward the old barn. The sun was just starting to set, making the sky turn pretty shades of pink and orange. A gentle breeze blew through the trees. When she reached the barn, Sarah slowly pushed open the big wooden door. It creaked loudly as it opened. Inside the barn, it was dark and musty. Rays of light came through holes in the roof. Sarah looked around, wondering what she might find. Then something in the corner caught her eye. She walked closer to see what it was. To her surprise, it was an old trunk. The trunk looked very old. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. Sarah's heart beat faster with excitement. What could be inside the mysterious trunk? She reached out and tried to open it, but it was locked. She felt a bit disappointed, but Sarah was determined to find out what secrets the trunk held. She examined the lock. It looked very old and rusty. Maybe she could break it open somehow. Sarah looked around the barn for something she could use. She spotted an old hammer lying on a shelf. Sarah grabbed the hammer. She positioned it at the lock and took a deep breath. Then, with a hard whack, she hit the lock with the hammer. The loud bang echoed through the empty barn. And just like that, the lock broke off and fell to the ground. Slowly and carefully, Sarah lifted the lid of the trunk. It made a creaking sound as it opened. She peered inside, excited to see what was in there. Sarah gasped as her eyes fell upon what the trunk contained. To be continued. This story segment is 278 words. The writing uses basic vocabulary and simple sentence structures to tell the story in a clear, easy-to-follow way. It describes the scene and Sarah's actions in detail to make it interesting and engaging for the reader. The segment ends on an intriguing cliffhanger to make the reader want to find out what happens next in the story. Sarah stared in amazement at what was inside the old trunk. It was filled with all sorts of fascinating things. There were old black and white photographs, yellowed letters tied with ribbon, shiny jewelry, and colorful mementos from long ago. Carefully, Sarah reached in and picked up one of the photographs. She gently wiped away the dust. The picture showed a young couple dressed in fancy old-fashioned clothes. They looked very happy together. Sarah wondered who they were. Under the photographs, Sarah found a small book. It had a worn leather cover. She opened it and realized it was a diary. How exciting! The diary was written by someone named Elizabeth. The first entry was dated June 12, 1845. Sarah sat down on the floor of the barn and started to read the diary. The writer talked about her daily life, the chores she did, the walks she took, and the people she spent time with. It was like a glimpse into the past. Sarah felt like she was right there with Elizabeth as she read her words. An hour passed quickly as Sarah pored over the contents of the trunk and the diary. The sun had fully set now, and the barn grew darker. Sarah knew she should probably head back home, but she didn't want to stop exploring the trunk and reading the diary. She wanted to learn more about Elizabeth and her life so many years ago. Sarah carefully packed up the photographs, letters, and diary. She closed the trunk and decided she would take everything back to her room to look through more. She could hardly wait to keep reading and to show her mom what she had discovered. Full of excitement, Sarah hurried out of the barn into the night. The old trunk had been an incredible find. She smiled thinking about the amazing story and secrets it held. Sarah knew she would always remember this day and the remarkable treasures the barn had hidden for so long. This story segment is 342 words, for a total of 620 words so far. It continues the story with vivid details and description to bring the scene to life. Basic language keeps it easy to read and understand. The segment captures Sarah's excitement at her discovery and ends with her heading home, eager to learn more, providing an intriguing hook that makes the reader want to find out what happens next as Sarah uncovers the secrets of the trunk and diary.